The rifle scope crosshairs settled on a German officer standing in a ruined building 400 meters away, visible only because he had made the fatal mistake of standing too close to a window where morning light illuminated his silhouette. And Vasily Zaitsev controlled his breathing the way he had been taught as a child hunting deer in the Ural Mountains, letting half the air out of his lungs and holding steady while his finger applied gradual pressure to the trigger. And in the instant before firing, he thought about what this German officer represented. Not just a single enemy soldier, but a symbol of the arrogance that had brought the Wehrmacht to Stalingrad, believing that Soviet resistance would collapse under pressure. And when the rifle fired and the German officer fell backward out of view, Zaitsev did not feel triumph, but rather grim satisfaction that he had delivered another small lesson in the education the Red Army was providing about the cost of underestimating Soviet determination. It was October 1942, and the battle for Stalingrad had been raging for 2 months, transforming the city into a landscape of rubble and ruins where normal military operations were impossible and where survival depended on adaptability and ruthlessness, conditions that favoured defenders who knew the terrain and who could use the destroyed buildings as concealment for ambushes and sniper positions. And Zaitsev had emerged as one of the most effective practitioners of this urban warfare, killing German soldiers with such consistency that his reputation had spread through both Soviet and German ranks, becoming a symbol of Soviet resistance and a source of frustration for German commanders who could not understand how a single sniper could have such disproportionate psychological impact on their troops' morale. The Germans had ignored Soviet snipers initially. These Wehrmacht officers and NCOs, who had been trained to believe that marksmanship was a specialized skill requiring extensive training and sophisticated equipment, and that Soviet forces, with their reputation for crude mass tactics rather than individual skill, could not possibly develop effective sniper programs that would threaten German operations. Assumptions that reflected the same underestimation of Soviet capabilities that had characterized German planning throughout Barbarossa, and that would prove catastrophically wrong as Soviet snipers like Zaitsev demonstrated that patience and fieldcraft and intimate knowledge of urban terrain could neutralize German advantages in training and equipment. The dismissal of Soviet sniper activity as propaganda rather than genuine tactical threat meant that German forces took inadequate precautions against sniper fire during the early months of the Stalingrad battle, with officers and soldiers moving carelessly through exposed areas and failing to understand that every window, every pile of rubble, every destroyed vehicle could conceal a Soviet marksman who had been waiting hours or even days for exactly this moment of carelessness, complacency, that Zaitsev and his fellow snipers exploited ruthlessly to inflict casualties that were individually small but cumulatively devastating to German morale. We'll pause briefly before continuing. If stories like this are important to you, please consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription. After watching, a short comment, even a simple one, helps these stories reach further. Your support ensures they are not forgotten. Thank you. Let's continue. What Zaitsev said during a political meeting with Soviet troops in late September 1942 became one of the most famous quotations of the Eastern Front. "There is no land for us beyond the Volga," words that captured the existential nature of the Stalingrad defense, and that represented a commitment to fight to the death rather than retreat, because retreating across the Volga would mean abandoning the city and potentially losing the entire southern front, making Stalingrad the place where Soviet resistance had to hold regardless of casualties or hardship. The phrase resonated with Soviet soldiers who understood that this was not rhetorical flourish, but literal truth, that if Stalingrad fell, then the oil fields of the Caucasus would be vulnerable, and the Soviet Union's ability to sustain the war effort would be critically compromised, giving the battle significance far beyond the immediate tactical situation and transforming every building and every street into ground that had to be defended with absolute determination, because the alternative was potentially losing the war itself. The psychological dimension of Zaitsev's sniper operations extended beyond the physical casualties he inflicted to include the terror and paranoia that his presence created among German forces, because soldiers who knew that a skilled sniper was operating in their sector became reluctant to move, reluctant to expose themselves even briefly, constantly scanning rooftops and windows and rubble piles for the glint of a scope or the barely visible outline of a concealed position. Anxiety that degraded combat effectiveness by making troops hesitant and defensive when offensive operations required boldness and momentum. German veterans who survived Stalingrad would later write about the psychological pressure of operating in an environment where any moment of inattention could be fatal, where the sniper you never saw could kill you before you even knew you were being targeted, creating constant stress that accumulated over weeks and months until soldiers became mentally exhausted and prone to errors that in other circumstances they would have avoided. Cascade of psychological effects that multiplied the tactical impact of sniper operations far beyond what the actual casualty figures would suggest. The training that Zaitsev had received was minimal by conventional military standards, consisting primarily of his childhood experience, hunting in the Urals, where he had learned patience and observation, and the ability to remain motionless for hours while waiting for game to appear. Skills that translated directly to urban sniper warfare, where success depended more on psychological discipline and environmental awareness than on formal marksmanship training, though his natural shooting ability had been refined through practice with the Mosin Nagant rifle that had become the standard Soviet sniper weapon, a bolt-action design that was reliable and accurate, but that required the shooter to work the bolt manually between shots, meaning that follow-up shots were slow and that the sniper's position would be revealed by muzzle flash and sound, requiring immediate displacement to avoid counter-sniper fire or artillery bombardment of the position. The simplicity of Zaitsev's equipment and methods stood in contrast to the sophisticated German sniper programs that used specialized rifles with advanced optics and that trained snipers for months before deploying them. Yet this simplicity proved advantageous in Stalingrad's ruins, where complex equipment was vulnerable to damage, and where the ability to improvise positions using whatever materials were available mattered more than having perfect equipment that required maintenance and care. The duel between Zaitsev and the German sniper Heinz Thorwald, whether it occurred exactly as Soviet propaganda portrayed it, or whether it was embellished for motivational purposes, became legendary as an example of the personal nature of sniper warfare, because unlike artillery bombardments or tank battles where the enemy was an abstraction, sniper duels involved two individuals hunting each other with the knowledge that success meant the other's death and failure meant your own, creating psychological intensity that few other forms of combat could match. The accounts describe a cat-and-mouse game lasting several days, where Zaitsev and Thorwald attempted to locate each other's positions through careful observation while avoiding exposing themselves to the other's fire, using decoys and false positions, and patient waiting to try to trick the opponent into revealing himself, until finally Zaitsev identified Thorwald's position through the reflection of his scope lens and made the shot that ended the duel, though whether Thorwald was actually the head of the German sniper school at Zossen, or whether he was simply a skilled German marksman whose death was embellished into a more dramatic narrative for propaganda, purposes remains debated by historians who note that German records contain no mention of a sniper named Thorwald being deployed to Stalingrad. The tactical impact of Soviet snipers on German operations in Stalingrad forced changes in German infantry tactics, with units learning to move only at night or during poor visibility when snipers would have difficulty acquiring targets, to use smoke to conceal movement through exposed areas, to avoid predictable patterns of movement that snipers could anticipate and prepare for, and to employ counter-snipers whose sole mission was hunting Soviet marksmen rather than conducting general combat operations, adaptations that reduced German casualties from sniper fire, but that also reduced German operational effectiveness by forcing units to operate more cautiously and defensively than German doctrine prescribed, demonstrating how a relatively small number of snipers could have strategic impact by forcing enemy forces to modify their entire approach to combat operations in ways that degraded their effectiveness. The kill count attributed to Zaitsev, officially 242 German soldiers during the Stalingrad campaign and eventually 309 by the end of the war, represents numbers that are difficult to verify precisely because battlefield conditions made accurate record-keeping nearly impossible, and because Soviet propaganda had incentives to inflate the achievements of heroes like Zaitsev, who served important morale purposes. Yet even if the actual numbers were lower, the qualitative impact of his operations, and those of other Soviet snipers, is undeniable based on German accounts that describe the fear and frustration that sniper activity created among Wehrmacht troops. The question of whether these kill counts should be celebrated as military achievements or mourned as human tragedies reflects broader ethical debates about warfare and about whether individual skill in killing should be honoured or whether all combat deaths represent failures of humanity. Debates that became particularly acute around snipers whose role involved deliberately targeting specific individuals rather than engaging in the more impersonal violence of mass combat. The method that Zaitsev developed for training other snipers, which eventually led to the creation of formal Soviet sniper schools that would produce thousands of trained marksmen, emphasized observation and patience over pure marksmanship, teaching students that successful sniping was 90% positioning and waiting and 10% actual shooting, because a sniper in the perfect position with mediocre shooting skills would be more effective than an excellent marksman in a poor position. Philosophy that reflected Zaitsev's own experience as a largely self-taught sniper who had succeeded through understanding battlefield psychology and terrain rather than through superior equipment or formal training. The Soviet sniper training program that emerged from Stalingrad would produce specialists who employed similar tactics throughout the remainder of the war, creating a tradition of sniper warfare that would persist in Soviet and later Russian military doctrine as an asymmetric capability that could be maintained relatively cheaply while providing disproportionate tactical and psychological effects. The German response to Soviet sniper activity evolved from initial dismissal through frustrated attempts at counter-sniper operations to eventual development of specialized anti-sniper teams that used sophisticated observation equipment and coordinated tactics to locate and eliminate Soviet snipers. Though these countermeasures never fully neutralized the Soviet sniper threat, because the urban terrain of Stalingrad and later battlefields provided such extensive concealment opportunities that finding a well-hidden sniper before he could fire and displace was extremely difficult, regardless of the resources dedicated to the task. The counter-sniper operations themselves became deadly games where both sides employed similar tactics of patience and deception, creating situations where German and Soviet snipers would spend days trying to outthink and outmaneuver each other, contests that were psychologically exhausting for the participants, and that resulted in casualties on both sides, though the strategic advantage remained with the Soviets, who were defending familiar terrain, and who could afford to trade casualties more readily than Germans, who were operating far from their supply bases. The propaganda value of Zaitsev to Soviet morale was enormous, with his achievements being publicized through newspapers and radio broadcasts that portrayed him as a heroic defender of the motherland, whose individual courage and skill embodied the larger Soviet resistance against fascist aggression, narrative that served important purposes in maintaining civilian morale and in demonstrating that ordinary Soviet citizens could become effective warriors through determination and commitment to defending their homeland. The elevation of Zaitsev to legendary status involved some exaggeration and mythologization of his actual achievements, with stories being simplified and dramatized to make them more accessible and inspiring to mass audiences. Yet the core truth remained that Zaitsev and snipers like him were genuinely effective at killing German soldiers and degrading German morale, making the propaganda not entirely fabricated, even if specific details were embellished for maximum emotional impact. The personal cost that Zaitsev paid for his sniper activities included severe eye injuries from a mortar explosion in January 1943 that temporarily blinded him and that required months of treatment before his vision partially recovered. Injuries that ended his frontline sniper career and that illustrated the physical dangers that snipers faced despite their concealment and careful tactics, because artillery and mortars could be directed at suspected sniper positions based on approximate locations even when the exact position could not be identified, saturating areas with explosive fire that could wound or kill snipers who had no protection against indirect fire. The fact that Zaitsev survived the war when so many of his fellow snipers did not reflected a combination of skill and luck, because sniper operations involved such high risk that even the most skilled practitioners could be killed by chance encounters or by mistakes that left them exposed for the crucial seconds required for enemy fire to find them. The post-war career of Zaitsev included work as a factory director and involvement in veterans organizations, relatively modest positions that did not fully reflect his wartime fame, but that were typical for Soviet veterans who were expected to return to civilian life and contribute to reconstruction rather than dwelling on wartime achievements, though Zaitsev did write memoirs that were published in the 1960s and that provided first-hand accounts of sniper warfare in Stalingrad, documents that have become important historical sources despite questions about how much his memories were influenced by decades of Soviet propaganda that had mythologized his wartime service. The restraint that Zaitsev showed in his post-war public appearances, avoiding excessive self-promotion while acknowledging his role in the Stalingrad defense, suggested a person who understood the difference between wartime necessity and peacetime values, who had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers because that was his military duty, but who did not glorify killing itself or present himself as someone who had enjoyed the violence, maturity, that contrasted with some veterans who seemed unable to move beyond their wartime identities. The technical aspects of sniper warfare that Zaitsev mastered included understanding how environmental conditions like wind, temperature, and humidity affected bullet trajectory, how to estimate range without sophisticated range-finding equipment using reference points and experience, how to identify and exploit momentary vulnerabilities in enemy positions when soldiers briefly expose themselves thinking they were safe, and how to manage the psychological stress of remaining motionless for hours while waiting for a target to appear. Skills that required both physical discipline and mental focus that few soldiers possessed naturally, and that even trained snipers struggled to maintain consistently under combat conditions. The Mosin Nagant rifle that Zaitsev used was not technologically superior to German sniper rifles, and in some respects was inferior in terms of optical quality and mechanical precision, yet in competent hands it was sufficiently accurate for the ranges at which urban sniping occurred, typically 200 to 400 meters, where the differences between rifles mattered less than the shooter's skill and the quality of the position, demonstrating that tactics and training could compensate for equipment deficiencies when employed intelligently. The German soldiers who were killed by Zaitsev and other Soviet snipers represented individual tragedies regardless of the military and political context, because each death meant a family in Germany receiving notification that their son or husband or father had been killed in Russia, grief that multiplied across hundreds of thousands of families as the casualty lists grew. And while it may be strategically necessary to kill enemy soldiers in warfare, the human cost should not be forgotten or treated as merely statistical, because every number in the casualty figures represented a person with hopes and fears and relationships that were ended by violence. The memorialization of snipers like Zaitsev as heroes creates moral complexity because it requires celebrating individuals whose primary skill was killing other human beings, And while this can be justified within the context of defensive warfare against aggression, it raises uncomfortable questions about whether societies should honour killing ability even when that ability was employed in morally defensible causes. The evolution of Soviet sniper doctrine, from the improvisations of Stalingrad to the formalized training programs of later war years, demonstrated institutional learning capacity that allowed the Red Army to identify effective practices and scale them across the entire force, creating standardized training that produced thousands of snipers who employed similar tactics and who achieved collective effects far beyond what even the most skilled individual could accomplish alone. This systematization of sniper warfare represented a broader transformation in Soviet military culture from the desperate improvisation of 1941 and 1942 to the sophisticated combined arms operations of 1944 and 1945. Evolution that reflected both learning from experience and the increasing availability of resources as Soviet industry mobilized for total war, though the human costs of this learning process were enormous given the casualties sustained during the period when Soviet forces were developing effective tactics through trial and error under combat conditions. The comparison between Zaitsev's individual achievements and the collective impact of all Soviet snipers during the war illustrates the relationship between individual excellence and systemic effectiveness, because while Zaitsev's 309 confirmed kills were impressive at the individual level, the estimated 200,000 to 400,000 German casualties inflicted by Soviet snipers collectively during the war represented the truly strategically significant impact, demonstrating that military effectiveness ultimately depends on creating systems that enable many competent practitioners rather than relying on a few exceptional individuals, though exceptional individuals like Zaitsev remained valuable for their propaganda and morale effects, and for their role in developing and teaching tactics that others could then employ. The daily routine of Zaitsev's sniper operations in Stalingrad involved meticulous preparation that began hours before dawn when darkness still concealed movement, arriving at predetermined positions while German forces were changing guard shifts and when attention would be least focused, settling into concealment that might consist of a pile of rubble, a shell-damaged building, or even a destroyed tank from which he had clear sight lines to likely German movement routes, and then remaining absolutely motionless for hours while waiting for targets to appear. Physical discipline that required ignoring hunger, thirst, cold, and the natural human desire to shift position when muscles cramped or when discomfort became acute, because even the slightest movement could reveal the sniper's position to observant enemies who were scanning for exactly such telltale signs. The mental aspect of this waiting was perhaps even more demanding than the physical, because maintaining focus and alertness for 8 or 10 hours while nothing happened except occasional distant sounds of combat required psychological resilience that prevented boredom from degrading observation, or from causing the sniper to become careless about concealment, and Zaitsev developed techniques for maintaining mental acuity, including silently reciting poetry or conducting detailed mental reviews of terrain features to keep his mind engaged without allowing thoughts to drift to subjects that might cause him to lose awareness of his immediate environment. The specific incident that Soviet propaganda made famous as the duel with Heinz Thorwald, regardless of whether Thorwald was actually a German sniper school director or whether the entire story was fabricated or embellished, captured essential truths about how sniper warfare operated at the psychological level, because whether or not the specific duel occurred as described, the pattern of Soviet and German snipers hunting each other through ruined buildings while trying to outthink and outmaneuver their opponents was absolutely real and was documented in numerous accounts from both sides. The tactical sequence that such duels followed typically involved initial detection, when one sniper noticed suspicious activity that suggested another sniper's presence, perhaps movement in a window that seemed too deliberate or a glint of light reflecting off optical glass, followed by patient observation to determine whether the suspicious location was actually occupied or was a decoy designed to draw fire and reveal the observer's position. And then if the sniper determined that an enemy was actually present, the challenge became how to get a shot without exposing oneself to return fire. Problem that might be solved by waiting for the enemy to make a mistake, or by using a decoy to trick the enemy into revealing his exact position, or by attempting to outflank the position using concealed routes that allowed approach from an unexpected angle. The psychological pressure that German soldiers experienced knowing that Soviet snipers like Zaitsev were operating in their sector manifested in various behavioral changes that Soviet observers documented, including German troops becoming reluctant to expose themselves even briefly, refusing to move through certain areas that had become known as sniper zones, developing superstitious beliefs about which times of day or weather conditions were safest, and in extreme cases developing psychosomatic symptoms like tremors or digestive problems that were attributed to stress rather than to any physical illness, patterns that indicated the cumulative psychological toll that constant sniper threat imposed on troops who could never fully relax or feel safe, because any moment of inattention could be fatal. The German commander's frustration with this situation was documented in captured orders that threatened severe punishment for soldiers who allowed themselves to be killed by snipers through carelessness, directives that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem because they assumed that sniper casualties resulted from individual negligence rather than from the inherent difficulties of operating in an environment where skilled enemies had comprehensive advantages in concealment and observation, and where even careful soldiers could be killed by snipers who had been waiting hours or days for exactly the right moment to take a shot. The training program that Zaitsev developed for other Soviet snipers emphasized principles that would seem obvious in retrospect, but that were revolutionary at the time when Soviet military training generally focused on mass tactics rather than individual skill, including the concept that snipers should operate in pairs where one person acted as the shooter while the other served as spotter and security. Division of labor that improved effectiveness by allowing the spotter to search for targets and monitor for threats while the shooter remained focused on the immediate task of preparing and taking shots. Zaitsev taught that patience was more important than shooting skill because a sniper in a good position who waited for the perfect shot would kill more enemies with less risk than a sniper who took marginal shots from exposed positions. And he emphasized that the primary goal was survival rather than maximizing kill count, because a living sniper who could operate day after day was more valuable than a dead sniper who had been killed attempting a difficult shot that was not tactically necessary, philosophy that contrasted with some Soviet military thinking that emphasized aggressive action and willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives. The specific tactics that Zaitsev employed included using decoys to draw German fire and reveal enemy sniper positions, placing a helmet or piece of equipment in an exposed location, and watching to see if enemy snipers would shoot at it, technique that required patience because experienced enemy snipers might recognize the decoy and refuse to engage, but that occasionally succeeded in getting enemy snipers to reveal their positions through muzzle flash or sound that could be used to estimate their location. Another tactic involved deliberately allowing low-value targets to pass without shooting them in order to wait for higher-value targets like officers or NCOs who might appear in the same location, calculation that required discipline to resist the temptation to shoot at the first target that appeared, and instead maintain concealment in hopes that a more important target would present itself, though this also carried the risk that no additional targets would appear and that the opportunity to inflict any casualties would be lost. The German countermeasures against Soviet snipers evolved to include dedicated counter-sniper teams that used artillery spotting scopes and other optical equipment to search for Soviet sniper positions from concealed observation posts, teams that would mark suspected sniper locations and then either engage them with their own snipers or call in artillery or mortar fire to saturate the area, tactics that were sometimes effective, but that required significant resources and that could not eliminate the sniper threat entirely because the destroyed urban terrain provided so many potential positions that Soviet snipers could relocate frequently and avoid being found even when German forces dedicated substantial effort to hunting them. The psychological warfare dimension of these counter-sniper operations included German attempts to intimidate Soviet snipers through displays of superior marksmanship or through propaganda suggesting that captured snipers would be executed as illegal combatants, threats that had limited impact because Soviet snipers understood that they were likely to be killed whether captured or not, given the brutal nature of Eastern Front combat and given German attitudes towards Soviet soldiers in general. The environmental conditions in Stalingrad during the autumn and winter of 1942–1943 created unique challenges for sniper operations because the combination of destroyed buildings, limited visibility from smoke and dust, and extreme cold affected both equipment performance and human endurance, with optical sights fogging or icing in cold weather, rifle mechanisms becoming sluggish from congealed lubricants, and snipers themselves suffering from cold-related injuries and reduced dexterity that made precision shooting more difficult. Zaitsev adapted to these conditions through techniques that included wrapping rifles in cloth to insulate them from temperature extremes, using minimal lubrication that would not freeze, and developing methods for maintaining body warmth during long periods of immobility, including using insulated positions and wearing multiple layers of clothing that could trap body heat, though these adaptations could not eliminate the physical hardship of remaining motionless in -20-degree temperatures for hours at a time while waiting for targets that might never appear. The verification process for claimed sniper kills involved witnesses who could confirm that targets had actually been hit and killed rather than merely wounded or missed, requirement that was sometimes difficult to satisfy because snipers typically operated in situations where direct observation of the target after impact was not possible due to the sniper needing to immediately displace to avoid counterfire, leading to situations where snipers were confident they had killed enemies but could not prove it according to official standards. Though the Red Army's bureaucratic requirements for confirming kills were relaxed somewhat during intense combat when maintaining detailed records was impractical, the inflation of kill counts for propaganda purposes meant that official tallies should be viewed with skepticism, though this does not mean the achievements were entirely fabricated, merely that the actual numbers were probably lower than claimed, and that some kills attributed to famous snipers like Zaitsev might have been achieved by others operating in the same area whose achievements were consolidated under more famous names for propaganda efficiency. The impact of Zaitsev's memoir, published in the 1960s under the title Notes of a Russian Sniper, though sometimes translated as War of the Rats, provided one of the few detailed first-hand accounts of urban sniper operations from the Soviet perspective, and became an important source for understanding how snipers actually operated as opposed to how they were portrayed in propaganda, though the memoir itself was shaped by decades of Soviet censorship and by Zaitsev's own selective memory of events that had occurred 20 years earlier, limitations that historians account for by corroborating Zaitsev's account with German records and with other Soviet sources when possible. The memoir's descriptions of the psychological dimensions of sniper warfare, including the fear and exhaustion and moral complexity of deliberately killing individuals who were visible as distinct human beings rather than as anonymous enemies in mass combat, provided insights that were valuable despite questions about specific factual details, because the emotional and psychological experiences Zaitsev described were consistent with accounts from other snipers and helped explain both the effectiveness and the costs of sniper operations. The influence of Zaitsev's tactics on modern sniper doctrine is visible in contemporary military training that emphasizes many of the same principles he employed, including the importance of patience and position selection over pure marksmanship, the value of operating in pairs for mutual support and security, the need to balance aggressive targeting with survivability, and the recognition that snipers' psychological impact often exceeds their direct casualty production, continuities that reflect the enduring nature of fundamental tactical principles, even as technology and equipment have evolved dramatically since World War II. Modern snipers use laser rangefinders and ballistic computers and night vision equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to Zaitsev, yet they employ the same basic approach of carefully selecting positions, patiently waiting for targets, and immediately displacing after shooting to avoid counterfire, demonstrating that while technology changes the details of how tactics are executed, the underlying principles of effective sniper employment remain constant across different eras and different conflicts. The ethical debates surrounding sniper warfare, which intensified after World War II as societies began questioning whether certain forms of combat should be considered illegitimate even when employed by forces fighting in just causes, touched on issues that remain unresolved, including whether deliberately targeting individuals for assassination-style killing is morally different from the impersonal mass killing of artillery or aerial bombardment, whether snipers should be considered illegal combatants who can be executed if captured, and whether societies should celebrate individuals whose primary military skill consists of killing other human beings with clinical precision. Zaitsev's case illustrates these ethical complexities because his actions were clearly militarily effective and were conducted in defense of his homeland against an aggressive invasion. Yet celebrating him as a hero requires acknowledging that what we are praising is his ability to kill hundreds of people. And while this can be justified within the context of defensive warfare, it creates moral discomfort that perhaps should not be easily resolved. The post-war Soviet treatment of sniper veterans, including Zaitsev, involved a combination of public recognition through medals and publicity and private marginalization when their wartime skills were no longer needed and when their combat experiences might make them psychologically unsuited for peaceful civilian life, creating situations where veterans who had been heroes during the war found themselves struggling to adapt to post-war society that had little use for the specialized skills they had developed and that sometimes viewed them with suspicion or discomfort because of the violence they had participated in. Zaitsev's relatively successful post-war career as a factory director suggested he had been able to navigate this transition better than some veterans, though memoirs and interviews from his later years hint at psychological struggles and difficulty reconciling his wartime identity as a killer with his peacetime identity as a civilian. Internal conflicts that were common among combat veterans, regardless of which side they had fought on or whether their wartime service had been morally justified. The German perspective on Soviet snipers, documented in letters and diaries that survived the war, reveals a progression from initial dismissal to grudging respect to near superstitious fear as the sniper threat became increasingly omnipresent, and as German soldiers realized that their technological and training advantages did not protect them from skilled Soviet marksmen who understood the urban terrain better than invading forces ever could. Some German accounts describe Soviet snipers as almost supernatural adversaries who could appear anywhere and kill anyone regardless of precautions, exaggerations that reflected the psychological impact of operating under constant sniper threat, but that also indicated the genuine effectiveness of Soviet sniper operations at creating an environment where German forces never felt safe and where every movement carried risk of sudden death from an unseen enemy, exactly the kind of psychological pressure that degraded combat effectiveness and that contributed to German strategic failures at Stalingrad and elsewhere. The technological limitations of World War II-era sniper equipment meant that effective range was typically limited to 400 to 600 meters under ideal conditions, and often much less in the smoke and dust of urban combat, constraints that shaped tactical employment and that made sniper warfare a relatively close-range affair compared to modern sniping, where shots at 1,000 plus meters are routine, though the shorter ranges of WW2's sniping also meant that snipers could more easily identify and target specific individuals and could observe the effects of their shots more directly, creating a more personal and psychologically intense form of combat than modern long-range sniping, where the enemy might be barely visible even through high-powered optics. The intimacy of WW2 sniper warfare, where snipers could often see their targets' faces and could watch them die after being hit, created moral and psychological burdens that modern snipers might experience to a lesser degree because of the greater distances at which they operate, though whether this psychological distance makes killing easier or merely different remains debatable. The legacy of Vasily Zaitsev in Russian military culture represents a complex mixture of genuine historical achievement and mythologized propaganda that has been adapted to serve different political purposes in different eras, from Stalin-era heroic worker-soldier narratives to post-Soviet attempts to reconnect with the Great Patriotic War as a source of national pride, transformations that have sometimes distorted the historical Zaitsev in ways that serve contemporary political needs rather than historical accuracy, though the core fact remains that he was an effective sniper who killed many German soldiers and who contributed to the Soviet victory at Stalingrad through his tactical skill and through the training and inspiration he provided to other snipers. The cinematic representation of Zaitsev in the 2001 film Enemy at the Gates brought his story to Western audiences who were largely unfamiliar with Soviet sniper operations and who found the personal drama of the duel with a German sniper compelling, even though historians noted significant inaccuracies in how the film portrayed both the specific events and the broader context of the Stalingrad battle, distortions that included romantic subplots that never occurred, tactical situations that would have been impossible given the actual terrain and combat conditions, and portrayals of Soviet military culture that reflected Western assumptions more than historical reality. The film's impact on popular understanding of Zaitsev and of Stalingrad more broadly demonstrated both the power and the limitations of dramatic adaptations of historical events, because while the film introduced millions of viewers to a story they would otherwise never have encountered, it also created misconceptions that would be difficult to correct because dramatic narratives are more memorable and emotionally compelling than nuanced historical analysis, leading to situations where popular understanding of Zaitsev derives more from Hollywood dramatization than from historical sources. The comparison between Zaitsev and other famous snipers from World War II, including Finnish sniper Simo Häyhä, who killed over 500 Soviet soldiers during the Winter War, and German sniper Matthäus Hetzenauer, who achieved 345 confirmed kills on the Eastern Front, reveals both the universal characteristics of effective snipers and the specific contexts that shape their operations, because while all three shared traits like patience, observational skill, and psychological discipline, the different military and geographic contexts in which they operated meant they employed somewhat different tactics adapted to their specific situations, diversity that illustrates how fundamental sniper principles must be flexibly applied rather than rigidly following standardized procedures. The ethical complexity of comparing these snipers' achievements is that it requires assessing individuals from opposing sides using similar metrics, treating killing ability as a skill that can be evaluated independently of the moral or political causes for which it was employed. Approach that may be appropriate for military analysis, but that becomes problematic when extended to broader moral judgments about the individuals themselves. The long-term influence of Zaitsev's tactical innovations on Soviet and later Russian sniper doctrine can be traced through training manuals and operational procedures that codified many of the principles he developed through practical experience, including emphasis on concealment and patience, preference for deliberate aimed fire over volume of fire, use of urban terrain for maximum tactical advantage, and recognition that snipers' psychological impact could exceed their direct casualty production, continuities that demonstrate how individual tactical insights can become institutionalized and persist across generations of military practitioners. The specific techniques that Zaitsev employed have been adapted and updated with modern technology, including thermal optics and laser rangefinders, but the underlying tactical philosophy remains recognizable as descended from the principles he demonstrated in Stalingrad's ruins, legacy that is perhaps his most significant contribution beyond his individual combat achievements. The personal trauma that Zaitsev experienced from his wartime service, though never explicitly documented in his published writings, can be inferred from patterns common among combat veterans who had killed large numbers of enemy soldiers at close range where the humanity of their targets was visible rather than abstracted. Psychological costs that included nightmares, difficulty forming emotional connections, struggles with moral questions about whether the killing was justified even when conducted in legitimate defensive warfare, and challenges readjusting to civilian life where the survival skills that had kept him alive in combat were not only unnecessary but potentially maladaptive. The Soviet cultural expectation that veterans should put the war behind them and focus on building socialism rather than dwelling on wartime trauma meant that psychological support for veterans was minimal, and that individuals like Zaitsev had to process their experiences largely in isolation or through informal veteran networks rather than through professional counseling that might have helped them integrate their wartime identities with their peacetime selves. The material conditions that Soviet snipers operated under, including shortages of ammunition that limited practice opportunities, equipment that was often worn or damaged, and that had to be carefully maintained with minimal resources, and food and supply situations that were frequently inadequate, created additional challenges beyond the inherent difficulties of sniper operations and demonstrated that Soviet snipers' effectiveness was achieved despite resource limitations rather than because of abundant support, testament to their adaptability and determination, though also indication that their achievements might have been even greater if they had been provided with resources comparable to what German snipers received. The contrast between Soviet snipers' material deprivation and their tactical effectiveness challenged German assumptions about the relationship between equipment quality and combat effectiveness, demonstrating that well-trained and motivated soldiers could overcome equipment deficiencies through superior tactics and determination, lesson that had implications for how military effectiveness should be assessed beyond simple comparisons of technological sophistication. The memorialization of Zaitsev through monuments and museums in Russia serves both historical and political purposes, preserving memory of the Great Patriotic War while reinforcing narratives about Russian military prowess, dual function that raises questions about whether such commemorations primarily serve historical understanding or contemporary political agendas. The statue in Volgograd and museum exhibits provide valuable educational resources while creating mythologized narratives that emphasize heroism while minimizing warfare's horror and moral complexity. The universal tendency to create heroes from war narratives, transforming effective killers into symbols of national virtue, reflects psychological needs for meaning and inspiration, but creates distortions where warfare's complexity is reduced to simple good versus evil narratives, and where individuals like Zaitsev become two-dimensional symbols rather than complex human beings who experience fear and moral uncertainty even while performing their duties effectively, challenge that requires acknowledging both genuine achievements and symbolic importance while recognizing the humanity and moral costs of wartime service.